I finally was able to snag this. This is the 1853, second half of 1853 edition of the Waverley Magazine from Boston. And the reason I wanted it is it has one letter from Mathew Franklin Whittier. There's nothing else in it of any interest to me, so I've got the whole volume, but I only want the one letter. And this came about because there was a dispute between four, maybe three or four people writing in under pseudonyms. And the question was whether Edgar Allan Poe had borrowed from or taken inspiration from the poetry of his friend Thomas H. Chivers when he wrote The Raven. Raven was published in 1845, but Chivers had published something in, I think it was 1842, that seemed kind of similar. And so there's a debate going back and forth. Well, I know that Poe didn't write The Raven. He didn't have anything to do with The Raven except made a couple little tiny changes. And the main change that he made was to take one of Matthew's favorite words, sublunary, out and put living human being instead of sublunary being, I think it is. I think it's the 9th stanza. So, I mean, Poe didn't write it. He didn't even revise it except for that one little thing and one or two other very minor points. So Matthew, of course, knew that because he was the original author. Well, he chimes in the middle of this discussion in Waverley Magazine, and he used his star signature. So we know absolutely 100%, I know that it's him. Now, a few entries ago, I talked about how Matthew confirmed for posterity that he was the star. And it's a letter where he signed as a comet. And I presented that. I'm going to put it back up on the screen. And you'll note that he uses his own brand of code. He kind of uses inferences and references and sounds very conversational, like it's really nothing. But actually, he's telling us that he was Ethan Spike, which was not known at this time. That's a satirical character that he wrote all his life, pretty much. And that he had been writing as the star. He was the real star that other people were appropriating, like Henry Ward Beecher appropriated it. And Matthew used that word. That's part of his code. And that he was now briefly signing as a comet. And that tied him in with Ethan Spike and so on. So that's an example of him using code. Now, he uses code very heavily in this letter that he wrote to Waverley Magazine to put everybody on notice, and nobody got it. Nobody paid the slightest attention to this. It's recorded in the Baltimore Society for Edgar Allan Poe, I think they're called. They made a mention of it because they're very thorough, but nobody has anything to say about it. The editor of Waverley Magazine never mentioned it, just went right over everybody's head, but it's there for posterity. It's there for us. Matthew is saying in this letter, in his own code, that he was the real author of The Raven. Okay, so we've got it here in black and white, but you have to decode it. Now, what I'm going to do is give one more example, and this is going to take a while, but it might be kind of interesting for you guys who are interested in evidence for reincarnation. I'm going to look at another example where Matthew used code, and I have to give a little bit of history to this. Matthew was writing as the star for the New York Tribune from the fall of 1844 until mid to fall of 1846. As soon as he left there, that's about the same time that Margaret Fuller, who was claiming that whole series as her own, she went overseas as the foreign correspondent for the paper, continued to use the star. Matthew kept right on using it himself in the Odd Fellow and the Portland Transcript and other places. Because it had been his pseudonym since 1829. So he wasn't about to stop just because Margaret Fuller falsely claimed that that was his work. Apparently he went to a convention. He went, I think it was Cincinnati, a anti-slavery convention, and somebody there talked him into going south and working for the New Orleans Daily Delta as a reporter of the police office, the arraignment hearings, which he had done in New York City for the New York Transcript back in 1834-35. So he knew the whole gig. He knew how to do it. And he had a very interesting style. He turned them into moralistic black humor, basically. And he did exactly the same thing for the New Orleans Daily Delta. And for the first year he did this, a few months in the summer of 1846, he signed with his middle initial F. He had been doing that in the Dial before he ever wrote under Margaret Fuller, who was the literary editor in the New York Tribune, he had been doing the same thing when she was the editor of The Dial, the transcendentalist newspaper magazine, The Dial. He'd been signing F there. That's not F for Fuller, that's F for Franklin, as in Mathew Franklin Whittier. So he picked up his middle initial as a signature again in the New Orleans Daily Delta, signing as F. And if you compare it to his earlier work in the New York transcript, it's exactly the same style, exactly the same voice. And I got a PDF today, a paper from Academia EDU. They send me people's papers occasionally by email. And this one analyzes a particular book for plagiarism. And the scholars have gone to great lengths to show that he lifted this section from that and that from that. I go on with like 70 different sources or something. If anybody took the time to apply those methods to the works that were plagiarized from Mathew Franklin Whittier, I think it would be an open and shut case. It would be obvious, because I don't have training in that, and I can pick it out myself, and have done so, with my database. I can show what's been plagiarized from what. But we're talking A Christmas Carol, we're talking The Raven, where Poe took out sublunary and Matthew used sublunary. He liked it so much he used it in 23 different works. If I could do that, I'm sure the professionals could do a much better job. So what I'm going to do is show you something that Matthew wrote for the New Orleans Daily Delta in code. And the reason he used code, because he was undercover. He was an abolitionist agent. He may have been working for William Lloyd Garrison under hypnosis. I seem to feel that he was working under Edward Elwell of the Portland Transcript, also a liberal editor. And there's some evidence that he may have been also keeping Elijah Wright of the Boston Chronotype in the loop, reporting to him. So there's a lot of evidence. But when I had my third regression session in 2013, April of 2013, I didn't know any of this stuff. I had the feeling that Matthew had been a spy, and I didn't have very much evidence for that. It all came later. I could go down and tell you exactly what happened, but basically, not going back into my notes, I knew very little about Matthew as a spy. I just felt it. I didn't know that he'd been in New Orleans at all, or that he'd worked in New Orleans. I didn't know anything about these letters. Well, in 1846, he signs F. In 1847, it's anonymous, and there was one other reporter kind of mimicking his style, so the waters are a little bit muddy there, but basically you can tell, or I can tell, Matthew's style and which are his. And in 1848, he just wrote a couple of pieces. And this one is about the Piscatorian Brotherhood, and it's in his overblown poetic style. When he was really BSing, when he was really hiding something, he would go into this kind of overblown BS style. And apparently what had happened is that he was down there to be a liaison for the anti-slavery contingent in the South, and probably people connected with the Underground Railroad. So they had to have some pretext for the meeting, so they went on a big fishing trip. Now, Matthew had to report his meetings in these columns. That's what he'd done for years. He'd written travel logs, and he would actually be reporting his contacts, because it was a lot safer than using the mails, which would be intercepted. So he would report his contacts, but he would make it sound like it was just kind of a chatty letter about his travels. See? Well, he did the same thing here, but I think he got found out. Somebody was smart enough to figure out what he was doing. And the reason I say that is because this is the last one, basically. 2 or 3 pieces that he wrote in 1848 for the Delta, and he's gone, see? And then, which I won't get into right now, then 2 pieces, an expose of a slave auction that he had intended in New Orleans, show up in the Boston Chronotype. So he had crashed, with the help of his friends down there, he had crashed what I think was a private slave auction, and wrote a scathing article about it in the Boston Chronotype when he got back. But I think he had to leave a little bit precipitously, right? So I don't have a physical copy of this, but I printed it out, and I've got copies I can put on the screen from the microfilm. So this appeared in the June 1st, 1848 New Orleans Daily Delta. It's called Chronicles of the Piscatorian Brotherhood. That means fish, of course, fishing. So it's written as though it's a real formal fraternity, you know, like the Masons or something, and they're going on an fishing expedition, but really these are fishers of men. These are members of the Underground Railroad in the South, see, and they have had a meeting. Now, let me read a little bit of the introduction. I want to give you an idea of Matthew's overblown style when he's going to be passing on secret information. Editor's Delta, this is the introduction. As the pleasing task has been assigned me of recording and transmitting to you the sayings and doings of the cordial fraternity, I must enjoin it upon you not to take anything that you may here find written for granted, but rather submit all the matter herein recorded to the test of your own knowledge of the, quote, genus homo, or else try them by the counsel of experience. Then, if they do not outrage the one or beggar the other, why, you may take them as they had been written on oath. In other words, this is code. That's all he's saying. This is code. Then he says, this order has been created by the fraternization of the military with the civil and religious Mingos of Baton Rouge, and has for its object, as these veritable chronicles will abundantly set forth in the sequel, and there was no sequel, the discovery of the secret of the genuine, quote, free and easy, a secret which has occupied the attention of all the virtuosos, antiquarians, and savants since the ancients first began to write Anno Mundi down to the present time, A.D. 1848. Well, Matthew was a mystic and a spiritual seeker, and he was a student of the Stoics. So he would kind of casually refer to the search for truth as the free and easy. See, we've got that in other places. So he's making it sound as though this was like a Masonic lodge that was seeking the mystical truth, but that's not what was really going on. And then he goes on here, let's see, a comical old burlesque by the name of Diogenes. Well, Matthew identified with Diogenes, who was seeking for the one honest man, and he signed as Diogenes in some cases. Also, I think when he signed in 1830 in the New York Constellation, which he soon became the editor of, wherever you see D in that paper, it may have stood for Diogenes. Anyway, he says, a comical old burlesque by the name of Diogenes reduced himself to such destitution in the pursuit of this secret, so he's tying the free and easy in with mystical quest, that he could not raise even enough to buy a decent pair of breeches, and so had to stick himself down into an Athenian tub with just his head visible. And he died without ever arriving any nearer a consummation of his wishes than when he trampled on the pride of Plato and told Alexander to get out of his sunshine. He has ever since been considered a famous humbug. Well, it's all joking. Now, but I think that these names would be known to the people that he's writing to. In other words, if Edward Elwell, the editor, or Elijah Wright, the editor, or William Lloyd Garrison were reading this, they would know who he was referring to. So he says they know who was attending this meeting, which is the whole point. All at length being in readiness, we stowed ourselves away in and about the vehicle. Shadagasco, the sage, and the big sachem, by the right of seniority, occupied the back seat, with the captain and Joshua for their vis-a-vis. The secretary comforted himself with the more airy position alongside the aforesaid African unit, and away we rolled in a great good humor for the Amite, to ensnare with treacherous allurements the hungry and confiding Phinites. The dim discovered prospect of houses, chimneys, pedestrians, fields, fences, trees, etc., rushed past us on either side, as if they were running a foot race to no place in particular, with a hot breakfast for the wager. The last sentence was just a red herring to get you distracted from what he just said, because each of these people are known abolitionists and known members of the Underground Railroad. See, we don't know who the sage was, but a philosopher. The big sachem was somebody apparently in a position of authority. The captain, we don't know who that was, or Joshua. The secretary was probably Matthew, who was taking notes. And then he took up a position, an airy position, I guess, outside, alongside the aforesaid African unit. Now, what is the African unit? There must have been a black man with them, see? So I can't necessarily interpret everything that Matthew wrote. I don't have specific memory about these things. I can feel it. So immediately when he's using code, I can feel that he's using code. He's slipped into it. But exactly what it is, I don't know. I don't know who these people are, but I know that whoever he was writing to knew who they were. Now, so that's an example. He uses the same kind of code in the Waverley Magazine. But first, I'd like to take a side trip into a hypnotic regression that I had in 2013, April of 2013. And this was what I would call an exploratory session, because my first ones were in 2008 and 2009, which is when I first started seriously researching this in a scholarly way. And this one was in 2013, like 4 years later. And I wanted to just get some leads. Basically, I didn't expect anything to come up that would prove anything because I'd already done quite a bit of studying, but I wanted to see if I could get some leads and focus on some particular areas. So I was curious about this business of Matthew being a spy for the abolitionist cause, and I wanted to see if I could get anything more out of it. So what I'm going to do is play you a little section, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. T is therapist and S is Stephen for myself. And I'm being asked about this because I wanted to go there and do this. And what you get is kind of an impression. This could be anywhere in the South, and I admit that a lot of this is generic. I could have just imagined it. It's possible. But I seem to have put myself in New Orleans, and I seem to have put myself in a newspaper convention, that I was attending a convention representing, in this case, the Portland Transcript, as I believed, and that I was also acting as a spy. So I didn't know that Matthew lived and worked in New Orleans on 2 successive summers and then a little bit on a 3rd summer. So I didn't know anything about Matthew working in New Orleans when I had this regression session. That came 3 years later in 2017. So I think it's kind of interesting. I'll go ahead and play that now from the actual tape recording, and then we'll move on to Waverley Magazine.
Take a deep breath and get out of your logic and see what images you see.
Chandeliers. Big halls with chandeliers and cigars. Yeah, and guys dressed up. Not the black and the top coats. We're talking light gray coats. And kind of fancier stuff with buttons and cigars and people acting important.
Now, is this are you in?
I think so. It's a lot of show. There's an awful lot of show there. People dressing fancy and fancy chandeliers and curtains and people acting fancy, and there's a whole fancy thing going on.
You're there doing.
Well, I'm doing 2 things. I am ostensibly a representative of this newspaper, but I'm also spying with regard to abolitionism. And I think I'm connecting with people who are against slavery down there, which is very touchy. Very touchy. So I have to constantly always have another rationale for everything I do. Everything has to have a double rationale. You can't ever do anything that would be out of character for your main purpose.
For your surface purpose.
Yeah, you can't go anywhere or see anybody or do anything that doesn't have a rationale. Yeah, or you're in trouble.
And so, is this sort of fun anymore?
No, it's not. I never thought it was fun. It was always awful. Yeah, it scared the crap out of me every single time. I never thought it was fun. I don't think I did that many times, but yeah.
So the main thing you're doing is
connecting with people and just getting information, just eyes and ears, what's going on.
So you're generally interviewing people about what's going on with slavery. Whoever talks to you.
I don't have any memory of that. What I have, my memory, I was speculating on that.
No, just be there.
I'm connecting with people who are closet abolitionists in the South and asking them, do you need anything, basically. Yeah.
So how do you connect?
Well, again, I have to have some other rationale to connect with them. And I don't know how I did that. Well, if they were a merchant in a shop, I had to go buy something in their shop. See, like that.
All right, so now we're going to get into this Waverley Magazine. Again, this is the second half of 1853, and you can see that I've marked the one for August 27, 1853, and we're going to put it up on the screen, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to have to bring down my light here and pump it up because it's very small type per usual, so I apologize for the lighting. And I'm going to break this down for you, okay? I'm going to show you what the code is. We'll do it, there's 3 paragraphs. We'll do it 1 paragraph at a time. You will see before we start that it's signed with his star. I didn't see anything else in this entire 6 months that was signed with a star. It was just Matthew making an appearance in the middle of this. He couldn't resist making an appearance, and it's a good thing that he didn't, because now for posterity, we have it. Dearie, dearie, says a Waverley Partington, what is the world coming to? Poe has actually written in the same style of Chivers, it is said. I don't care if he wrote in a dozen styles. Now, likely as not, he was one of those that wrote what he chose, and when he chose, and the way he chose. A real mockingbird, wasn't he? Well, P always loved the mockingbirds because they don't everlastingly make the same sounds. But all birds haven't that gift, you know. Now, let me unpack this for you, okay? First off, a Partington, that's a reference to Mrs. Partington. That was Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber's character. Matthew collaborated with Shillaber and even wrote one of Shillaber's characters by his permission in the carpetbag, signing with the same signature, a star. So there is a story in the carpetbag about one of Shillaber's characters, Ike, Mrs. Partington's delinquent nephew, Ike, and it's signed with Matthew's star. So he knew Shillaber very well, and he knew the Mrs. Partington character because he had written similar characters like 20 years earlier. And so Mrs. Partington was always confused. She didn't get it right. She always got things wrong. So he's telling these people they've got it all wrong by calling them Partingtons. Now he acknowledges that what the argument is, that Poe wrote in the same style as Chivers. And he says, I don't care if Poe wrote in a dozen styles. Well, in fact, Poe, being a massive plagiarist, did write in a dozen styles, and that's what Matthew's referring to. Okay, and he goes on with that. So we don't misunderstand what he's saying. He called him a real mockingbird. A mockingbird imitates all the other birds' songs. So he's saying that Poe imitated a whole bunch of other people as like a mockingbird, okay? Now he says, well, P always loved the mockingbirds. Oh, that's not Poe. That's Poyen. That's Matthew's beloved first wife's maiden name, Abby Poyen. And he's referring to Abby. She was a literary prodigy, but also a musical prodigy who had a wonderful singing voice and loved birds, as I've found out from many different sources. And she wrote a poem called Ode to the Mockingbird, which her teacher, Albert Pike, later reworked and claimed credit for. Her classroom teacher was not ever Albert Pike, not the original. Albert Pike said that he wrote it 2 days after his marriage, which was in 1834, but Ode to the Mockingbird appeared in the version that Abby wrote 2 years earlier in 1832 in The Essayist, signed AP. They had the same initials. That's a whole other story. But he's here referring to Ode to the Mockingbird and the fact that Abby loved the mockingbirds. But that's extremely significant here because then he says all birds haven't that gift, you know. Well, if P is not Poe, P is Poyen. If P is Abby, who loved the mockingbirds, then who is the one that doesn't have the gift? It's Poe, okay? Edgar Allan Poe is the one who doesn't have the gift, the bird that doesn't have that gift. So he's a mockingbird, but he's a lousy one. That's what Matthew's saying in this first paragraph. Now, we know that Edgar Allan Poe is an imitator. He's a bad imitator, and he's not original, okay? So keep those things in mind because he has already established those facts. Now we go to the second one. Girls, and this is, of course, just derogatory. Girls, now I think of it, it will never do for you to make your bread as your grandmothers did. If you do, Though the flour and the milk and the yeast is your own, and you can knead and bake it yourselves, your grandmothers will have the praise. You little, quote, echoes, as sure as Fiat Justitia, one of the people writing in, dines with you, I guess the roses will mount your cheeks when he tells you in severe tones that he has tasted a crumb from an old loaf, that there is no mistaking this matter, that one loaf was taken from the other just as sure as the first was ever baked. Girls, girls, I say, make your own receipts. Now, Matthew would put the key word or the pun in italics, not always, but in other words, there'd be other things that were in italics for emphasis, but when he made a pun or there was a double entendre, he'd put that in italics to put us on notice. Receipts is an old word which means recipes, but it also means receipts. It has a double meaning. I say, make your own receipts, or you will never prove that you have originality. True, you may gain notoriety as housewives, but you will never be natural cooks like your grandmothers. Let's unpack this one. Girls means that he's pissed at them, that he doesn't respect them. And bread is, of course, a metaphor for writing. And he's saying that Fiat Justitia has detected something in the raven that came before it, which was Cheever's poetry, see? And he calls them little echoes because they're all imitating, you know. Poe and Cheever's, all of them were imitating. And I'll get into how that could be in a bit. So the old loaf is the original, of course. And he says, make your own receipts. Now, receipt is a recipe, which means original writing, but it's also proof. Okay, a receipt is proof of purchase. So they're making their own proof. Okay, does that make any sense? So he says, you may gain notoriety, which Edgar Allan Poe gained from publishing The Raven as his own. He got notoriety, but it wasn't his poem. So that's what that second paragraph means. Now Matthew is going to establish that he was the original author of the poem in question. Remember the context, because this context is, did Poe originate The Raven? Okay, so now we're going to talk about, he's already said Poe did not originate The Raven. He couldn't have because he was a bad mockingbird. So we've already established that he's an imitator and a bad one at that. And The Raven is an excellent poem, so ipso facto, he could not possibly have originated The Raven because he's a bad imitator. So now Matthew is going to establish his own authorship. When I write, I shall startle the world by writing without rule, measure, or style. And for keeping house, I've a snug little plan of my own. My chairs will be on their sides, the tables and timepiece bottom upwards, my drawer handles inside, my kittens in cages and my canaries at liberty. In short, you don't catch me, quote, dying into an echo, which means his legacy disappearing, as poor Poe would if he had lived long enough to, which means if he lived long enough to try to write on his own, he would have been forgotten. Depend upon it, I will prove that I have some original ideas, this is emphasized, and some little ways of my own, that's his code, or you see, I never should be considered a genuine Partington. Now, I don't quite understand the last reference, but I think he means that he is really one of the people that wrote Mrs. Partington, because he also wrote the fall biography of Mrs. Partington for Shillaber. See, so that was him. Okay, a lot of Partington is actually his, and in the books that Shillaber wrote later on or published later on, a lot of that material is Matthew. So he was like the genuine Partington. Okay, and there's his star signature. But let's go back into this. What he's saying is that he is actually original, whereas Poe, he's already said, is a poor imitator. He is original, and that he has ways, little ways of his own. So the little ways of his own are the coded references he has embedded in these pieces for posterity. And there's a whole bunch of them regarding The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe. There's like 17 or 18 or 20 embedded references, which I've got in my paper. You know, you can access this paper, go to my website, www.il.goldthread.com, look for the articles tab, click on that, and you will see the paper on Poe, which you can download. or you can put in my name and search on Academia EDU and come up with the same paper for download. I've got maybe not all of them, but I've got a whole bunch of these coded references that Mathew published, all saying, including this one, all saying that he wrote The Raven and Poe stole it from him. Okay? So that was his little ways and means. So here we have Mathew Franklin Whittier saying in no uncertain terms on August 27, 1853, that Poe could not possibly have written The Raven, which I keep saying, and that he was the original author, and that they're all mistaken. You know, all of these guys that are arguing. And then that was it. He didn't come back. There's no more star sign pieces. There's nothing more of Matthew's in this whole. This was a kind of a superficial journal. You know, bad writers, superficial writers. He would never have published in this. He didn't have any interest in it, but somebody must have brought it to his attention, or he happened to see it somehow, and he decided to set the matter straight in code, and nobody paid the slightest attention to it, just like probably for at least a while, nobody will pay the slightest attention to this entry, okay? But I've got the evidence. I've got the evidence 10 times over, like 17 times over. I have the evidence that Mathew said that Poe stole The Raven from him and that he was the original author. And Mathew can back it up, whereas Poe was a bad imitator who was a massive plagiarist. And I've proven that he plagiarized. You know, one of the ways I proved it is going back into his early poetry. He was not a religious man, but God comes up many times in his grief poems, which were not his. And I know that he plagiarized them because two of them have opposite philosophies. You don't flip-flop. He went from spiritualist ideas, really authentic spiritualist ideas, which Mathew was well familiar with. And then 3 years later, he writes a mumbo jumbo of nonsense about life after death. See, well, you don't do that. You don't go from really understanding that subject, which I have studied for 50 years. And I know when I see the authentic thing and when I see somebody just farting around, you don't go from something authentic and 3 years later write gobbledygook. So he stole those poems. Either that or he wrote the second one, which is possible. But he definitely plagiarized the first one, and that was his habit, to plagiarize from grieving widowers. This guy was a real ass. Okay, so now, as far as Chivers is concerned, the question is, well, what about this? You know, what about elements in The Raven that appear to be in Chivers' poetry? Well, it turns out that although Chivers was a Southerner, he was a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, the spiritualist type mystic, philosopher. And so was Mathew during this time, especially after Abby died. Abby died in March of 1841. He would have written The Raven after an experience, which was, he literally wrote about that experience in The Raven, and that would have been December of 1841. Chivers was writing to Edgar Allan Poe from New York from about 1840 to 1842. I found letters dated those 2 years from New York City. So Chivers was traveling in the north. All it would take would be for them to both attend a Swedenborgian convention, for them to meet each other, to find out that they were both poets, and for Mathew, who was very naive, to show this poem, The Raven, to Chivers. So Chivers used some elements of that poem. He might not have taken a copy, but he used elements of it when he wrote poetry of his own. I think it was in 1842. So they would have met prior to that. And then Chivers might have shared something of that with Poe, or I think that Mathew shared The Raven with Poe in the first half of 1842. So Poe, that being his modus operandi of stealing poetry from grieving widowers and people that were unknown. Well, Mathew was unknown because he, wrote under pseudonyms. He wasn't unknown because he had just started writing poetry in grief. See, that was Poe's usual victim, was somebody that started waxing eloquent in poetry because they had lost somebody. But Mathew had been writing since before Poe was, 1825. He just wrote everything anonymously under pseudonyms. So Poe didn't know that, and he imagined that he had another victim, see? So he got a physical copy. He made sure to get a physical copy. And then when Mathew finally published The Raven under the pseudonym Blank Quarles in American Review, it appeared in the February edition, Poe, being a reviewer in New York City for the Evening Mirror, got an advance copy, and seeing that Mathew was going to publish this thing, he apparently decided to scoop him in his own paper, the paper that he wrote for, the Evening Mirror, and convinced the editor that it was his poems. He had a physical copy of it. And he scooped Mathew by about 2 days. I think it was the January 29, 1845 edition of the New York Evening Mirror, and put his own name on it. And he took out the phrase sublunary being and substituted living human being. And that's a dead giveaway because, as I said, that was one of Mathew's favorite words, sublunary. That's just one of the 17 pieces of evidence, It's just overwhelming. And it's just a matter of sheer stubbornness and attachment to position and whatever. There's a club called the Raven Society. If they admitted the obvious, what I'm saying, they would have to change their name because Poe didn't write The Raven. He didn't write Annabel Lee either. That was also Mathew's. So I'm sitting on this discovery where I've got way more evidence than I need. And out of stubbornness, I can't get anybody to take it seriously, see? But, sooner or later, meanwhile, I've got this letter, I got a physical copy of it. And if I ever have a little museum that's dedicated to Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier's work, they're going to have a physical copy of this.